welcome everyone to the Delphi Economic Forum. I'm Creon Butler, and I'm the head of the Global Economy and Finance program in Chatham House. And Chatham House is really delighted to be a knowledge partner for the Delphi Forum, and also to be moderating this session today. Now, quite rightly, policymakers have focused overwhelmingly over the past month on the Ukraine crisis and the response to the Ukraine crisis. But it's important to remember that the pandemic is not over, and indeed we need to get accustomed to get used to the longer term consequences of the pandemic for our economy, for our society, and for our politics. And today we're going to focus on the economic aspects of that legacy, and in particular to look at how that legacy may affect in different ways major economic blocs in the world, the EU, the US, China, the emerging economies, and others. And I'm really delighted today to have two really great experts with me to help in getting into this issue. And with me here in Delphi is Megan Greene, who's the senior fellow at the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's also an FT columnist and also a colleague of mine at Chatham House, where she's a Deanne Julius International Fellow in Economics. And online, I'm also delighted to be joined by David Lubin, who is the Managing Director and Head of Emerging Economies, Economics at Citi, also a Chatham House Fellow, and also somebody who writes regularly in the FT. So we have today the first kind of key question, which is when you look at the long-term impact of the pandemic, how do you think it's going to affect the relative economic power of different blocs in the world? And I mean, you can define economic power as you wish. You can talk about the ability to promote the prosperity of your own people, or the ability to influence the world around, whether in an economic sense or political sense. So Megan, would you like to have a go at that question?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Creon. So in talking about the long-term impact of the pandemic economically, I would say there are a few different factors. One is that governments are playing a much bigger part in our lives than we had expected beforehand, probably much to the great relief of central bankers, actually. So whereas central banks were the only game in town before the pandemic, that's no longer really the case. Fiscal authorities, not that central banks didn't do their jobs, they certainly did when the pandemic hit, but fiscal authorities also stepped in and did quite a lot, and have ramped up a whole bunch of debt the world over, which I think is a concern in particular now that the Fed is hiking rates fairly, or will be hiking rates fairly aggressively. So it's a factor both in terms of debt, but also in terms of industrial policy. I'm based in the US, where we have an incredibly divided society and incredibly divided politics, but the one thing that both parties can absolutely agree on is industrial policy. If you had told me that that would be the case 10 years ago, I would have said you were crazy. There's no way we would all be in favor of industrial policy, but I think that's here to stay. You know, Trump's Make America Great Again strategy and Biden's Buy American strategy are kind of the same thing. Different tactics, certainly, to get there. Biden's version has much cuddlier language, for sure, but for multinationals doing business, in practical terms, they're not that different. So that's another factor. One other big economic impact is productivity growth, I think. So this is on the optimistic side. I think if you look at surveys that have been done with firms, a lot of them have used the opportunity of lockdowns to go ahead and finally automate and digitalize. And you know, as part of the Next Gen EU funds, one of the requirements was to earmark a significant amount for digitalization. Capital is still cheap, even if it's getting less cheap. There hasn't been a whole lot of investment in the developed world for roughly 15 years, so there's pent-up investment to be done. So I do think we're going to see productivity growth off the back of this. And that's a big difference from the 1970s, 1980s, for what it's worth. We had productivity falling then, and now we've got a massive jump in productivity growth, I think. And then finally, I think resilience is a factor that we hadn't really considered before. Economists really love efficiency. That has always been our top priority. I think increasingly resilience will be a top priority, and that goes for supply chains. So I don't actually think that we're deglobalizing and regionalizing as much as we economists had originally suggested we might. But I do think that supply chains are being turned into kind of a supply chain plus model where you have your normal supply chains, but then you've got contingency plans as well. And as we're looking at war in Europe, I think a lot of firms are moving even further in that direction. So I think those are the biggest economic impacts.
And you mentioned both sides of the political divide agree on the need for industrial policy. Obviously, they have different visions of what that industrial policy would be. But do you think either way it could make the US economy stronger, more competitive, increase its economic power relative to other countries? Or do you think, we've all had experience, as we did in the UK in the 70s, of big state companies which were a massive drain on our economic capabilities? So which do you think that it will be in the US? Yeah, so as a kind of free marketer, I think that it's more likely to be a drag, and that the wins will be fairly short-lived. But that being said, it really does have support. It depends on exactly how you do it, but I think overall industrial policy, which Europe is also engaging in, is probably not a great thing for competitiveness and productivity. Great. Now, David, perhaps I could put the same question to you. How do you think the long-term effects of the pandemic will affect relative economic power?
Thanks very much, Creon. I think the pandemic is one thing, but it probably shouldn't be seen in isolation as something that changes the balance of economic power. I think the war in Ukraine and a bunch of things that were happening pre-pandemic, in particular, the rise of global protectionism. These kind of three things, the pre-pandemic rise of global protectionism, the pandemic-related emphasis on supply chain resilience, and the war-related emphasis on energy independence and supply chain resilience, are all, I think, creating an environment which is particularly unfriendly for developing countries. The starting point is to understand that developing countries are the sort of textbook case of small open economies. And therefore, in order for developing countries to enjoy economic activity, the critical variable in the global economy is not the rate of global GDP growth, but rather the rate of global trade growth, or rather, in a way, the ratio of trade growth to GDP growth. When that ratio is high, that allows developing countries to take part in global economic activity. For decades after the Second World War, that ratio was indeed very high. In the decade after the global financial crisis, however, that ratio, in other words, trade growth related to GDP growth, collapsed. And I think that collapse in trade growth was one of the central reasons why we all started to have to worry about why emerging markets growth seemed so weak in the decade after the global financial crisis. And my concern is that the effects of the pandemic and the effects of the current war are to intensify that collapse of trade growth relative to GDP growth. Consider that in China, for example, both for geopolitical reasons and for ideological reasons, there's a much stronger sense of self-reliance, of inward-looking economic policy. What that means is that a renminbi of domestic spending in China has fewer spillovers for other emerging economies. And I think that theme of self-reliance is evident in the United States, as Megan was saying, and in Europe as well. And so, although, as Megan suggests, there might be more investment spending in the West in the next few years, I worry that the kind of the trade that results from that investment spending might be lower than it would otherwise be, because the new investment spending that's going to come through in Europe and the United States has a kind of inward-looking quality to it, and therefore the trade spillovers of developed country investment spending in the next few years will not be terribly growth positive. And so I think, in terms of, we've been through a period of the last 30 years where developing countries were able to achieve a reasonable amount of income convergence, shrinking the gap between their per capita GDP levels and per capita GDP in the developed world. But I worry that process of income convergence which is dependent on globalization being a strong force, even though, as Megan says, we may not be fully going into deglobalization, even being able to argue that we're beyond the peak of globalization, and that something is happening to globalization, I think is enough to make life much more difficult for developing countries in the next few years.
So I grouped all the emerging economies together, but they're clearly very different. And you mentioned China as one example, and then obviously at the other extreme you have countries like Singapore, very small countries, very much aligned in a way with at least part of the future, if you like, the Western economic bloc within the future world. If we focus particularly on China, it's an enormous country, and there's a lot that it can do because of its scale, where it doesn't actually need, if you like, to be part of the global world. Or is that wrong? Is it wrong to look at it that way?
Actually, when I should have said, when I talked about developing countries, I was really meaning developing countries outside China. I think China is a shaper of economic life for developing countries. I mean, I know that Chinese policymakers like to emphasize its status as a developing country, and by many measures it still is. But it's a big and it's a very big economy with lots of capacity for self-sufficiency. So small open economy doesn't quite fit to the Chinese economy.
But China has the particular challenge coming up, which is, I assume, a transition from the no-COVID policy to opening up to the world. And I mean, this is one of the feature of the pandemic as to how unpredictable things have been. What seemed to be a really, fantastic policy at the outset in terms of protecting people from disease, protecting Chinese people from some of the longer-term effects of COVID, which others may face, now is a kind of problem, because if they are going to open up, this is going to have a major impact. I mean, what is your view of that transition? Do you think it's going to happen, and how painful do you think it will be?
Well, I think it will have to happen. I mean, it's very, very unlikely to happen in 2022 because I think the Chinese leadership's obsession this year now is with the 20th Party Congress, which will take place in October, November. So anything, given the fact that any move away from zero tolerance COVID policy in China is going to, unfortunately, involve people dying. That kind of bad news will want to be rolled out at a time that is politically much more convenient than 2022. And in addition, Chinese mRNA vaccines, the rollout of COVID drugs, pills, will be necessary, I think, before China can move away from zero tolerance policy. I'm sure they will, but it will be later rather than sooner. And one reason for that is that part of this kind of ideological or geopolitical emphasis on self-reliance, in a way, kind of fits nicely with the zero tolerance policy towards COVID. In particular, one of the major drains on China's balance of payments over the last few years was the outflow of Chinese tourists, and keeping the borders closed, in effect, saves China $200 billion a year, and allows Chinese households to kind of get used to the idea of spending holiday time domestically rather than abroad. And I think that kind of fits well with Chinese policymakers' emphasis these days on self-reliance.
Thank you. Megan, we talked about the US, but obviously also another major bloc which has gone through the COVID experience is the EU.
Yeah.
And there we've seen, two examples in terms of the next-gen EU policy, but also the Common Purchase Programme for vaccines, which in a way have shown EU capabilities expand through the experience of the pandemic. And to some extent, we're seeing this applied now in relation to the Ukraine crisis. So how significant do you think that is in terms of a long-term impact, which will mean if you like, the EU is going to be a stronger economic player in the future?
Mm-hmm. So I think we'll find out soon, to be honest. I mean, the Next Gen EU fund was a great innovation that would be more important in the next crisis than in the pandemic. I always thought there are big questions about whether EU countries can actually absorb all the money that they've gotten from Brussels. It turns out they're not very good on average at doing that, partly because of a lack of good projects, but partly because of local administration and bureaucracy. And so there was a question on whether EU countries would kind of screw it up or whether they would manage to absorb this money, deploy it to boost productivity growth and potential growth, and therefore, encourage Northern European countries to do this again. We haven't had a chance to find out, but it looks like maybe we'll need another one. So it seems to me like the ECB is winding down its bond purchases, maybe later this year, and is egging the fiscal authorities on to come up with some kind of funding mechanism for defense spending, for energy subsidies, for the green transition. It will take time to put something together, and we don't know yet whether there's political appetite for that. The German finance minister has come out pretty clearly against it. And it's, in fact, in the German coalition agreement not to have a new recovery fund. So there is certainly clear opposition to it. So we'll see. There is also a lot of unused money from the Next Gen EU fund that can be repurposed. But the green transition is going to be really expensive. And so I doubt that there's enough in there for Europe to actually successfully hit its net zero targets, let alone reduce its reliance on Russian energy immediately. So my answer is that we don't actually know. It seems like there might be rumblings that this could be a model for how the EU moves going forward, but it might not.
Indeed. I mean, the way in which the sort of EU is being used as a response to shocks, I mean, it seems to be a natural thing that EU countries do if there's a resilience issue to go to the European institutions. And you said that resilience is going to be a big part of the long-term legacy. I mean, do you think that in a sense over time, as we may have a series of future shocks like this, that this will actually be a major driver for institution building within the EU, even to the extent of building a kind of fiscal component in the EU economy, which, in a sense, deals with a structural problem that we both know about? Yeah,
so I would say the European project came about because of a crisis to begin with. Yep. All innovation happens in the EU because of a crisis. So if we have a series of crises, might that push policymakers to take steps forward? Yes. Will we get a full fiscal union off the back of that? It's impossible to say. I sort of doubt it. But could we get, more of a banking union than we already have? Maybe. So I think any sort of progress will be incremental, even in the face of crises. I mean, the steps that we saw in the pandemic response were extraordinary. There was a real urgent crisis immediately, and there were other things being negotiated. So there was horse trading that could happen. The nature of this crisis so far might not be as acute as what the pandemic seemed like initially. So there might not be the same pressure this time around that we had in early 2020.
Thank you. David, we've talked a bit about some of the kind of the trade and the financial consequences of the pandemic, but there's also, if you like, a human capital side to the consequences of the pandemic. I mean, there's if you like, the impact of COVID. We don't yet know what the consequences of long COVID will be, but clearly some countries which have been far more exposed up to now could have a much bigger problem in terms of the impact in their health systems, longer term productivity and so on. But also, absolutely crucially, there's the impact on the education system. And countries responded very differently in terms of how frequently they closed down schools, how far they provided online teaching, and therefore there are very different impacts in terms of the human capital consequences. I mean, if you want to look at China or some other emerging economies, do you think that this human capital issue is going to be a major differential between emerging economies or between the emerging economies and the advanced economies in terms of the long-term impact of the pandemic?
I think for emerging economies, the particular problem is to do with the lack of fiscal space. It seems weird to talk about the lack of fiscal space for developing countries where the average public debt GDP ratio in the emerging world is close to 60%, whereas in the developed world it's closer to 110 or so percent. So, just looking at the numbers, you might think that there was a lot of fiscal space among developing countries, but unfortunately that's not the case. By definition, if you like, developing countries have less fiscal space, and the fact that they were able to respond to the pandemic with a much less generous package of support, although there were countries like Brazil and South Africa that did a lot. In general, the amount of fiscal space that emerging markets policymakers had to respond to the crisis was limited, and that remains the case. And fiscal space is going to be further constrained for developing countries as US monetary conditions tighten, as the Fed, as Megan talked about earlier, addresses its own inflation problem. Historically, the United States having an inflation problem to address is generally bad news for developing countries' access to international capital markets. And therefore, the ability for developing countries to finance additional spending will be even further constrained by monetary tightening in the United States. So to the extent that developing human capital requires public sector resources, I worry that the availability of those public sector resources is going to be even more constrained in the future than it has been in the past. And to be honest, there are not that many emerging market policy-making environments where you can kind of, confidently say that these policymakers have a kind of coherent plan to develop human capital. So even if there were fiscal space, I'm not sure the plans are in place. Yeah. And unfortunately, the situation at the moment seems to be that neither are the plans in place to protect human capital and develop human capital, and nor is there the fiscal space to afford it.
Yeah, indeed. Obviously, human capital is a key issue in the US, and to some extent, the developments in the labor market already suggest that there's been something that's happened as a consequence of the pandemic for the way the labor market is behaving. But you've also got the education consequences and the health consequences. What's your view on the human capital consequences in the US of the pandemic?
Yeah, so I guess I would compare the US with Europe, because we took completely different approaches to the worker in the pandemic. Europe tended to to prioritize maintaining a connection between workers and their employers. The US just laid everyone off and then showered them with cash in a way. And so, initially the view was that the US had closed its output gap much faster than Europe, and so maybe that had been a success. What we're seeing now, if you're following the labor market data, is that a whole bunch of American workers have disappeared. So the Eurozone's labor force participation rate has recovered back to where it was before the pandemic. But in the US, ours is still way below where it was, and we don't really know why. But we have some ideas. It seems likely related to COVID, mostly related to COVID, but also a lot of workers had a financial cushion. We've created mostly pretty bad jobs in the US since the global financial crisis, these hourly, low-wage, low-hour services jobs that hardly allow people to make ends meet, don't come with benefits. And so a lot of people don't want those jobs. And those are the jobs we've had trouble filling. If you look at the labor market data, our labor market has been healing, but in a lot of these services sectors, we still can't find workers. And so it's possible that with a financial cushion, a lot of people decided they weren't going to go for those jobs and would just sit it out for a while. And so, I think that's problematic. My view is that the labor supply issue, the tightness in the labor market, will abate as COVID becomes more endemic, hopefully, fingers crossed, and also as workers have to capitulate for a paycheck. And so I think we'll get workers back. The jury's really still out on that. But it also means, our inflation problem started much earlier in Europe and is of a different nature. We laid everyone off. So then when they came back to the labor market, the best time to negotiate at higher wages is when you're negotiating your contract for a new job. And so Europe didn't have that factor. It means we kind of started off with second round effects in inflation in the US, which Europe hasn't had. Europe, its inflation is mostly driven by higher energy costs, higher food costs. And so I think there are big questions about where the American worker is and whether our system of laying people off and then trying to support them on, with beefed up unemployment benefits and stimulus checks is really a better way to support people. We do know from a lot of data that inequality has gotten much worse across the developed world and parts of emerging markets actually over the course of this pandemic. And I think that's a problem if you also consider the fact that we've lost a lot of workers.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you doesn't sound like you think anything in the labor market is going to change fundamentally. I mean, it may take time to get back to where we were before, but fundamentally we will. Or am I kind of misinterpreting what you said?
I think some workers will come back into the labor force, but it will take time. It's already taking time, whereas Europe has already seen its labor force participation rate recover.
And what about other things that happened during the pandemic? So use of technology, working from home. Do you see any of these as having a fundamental impact on the way the US economy works in the future?
Yeah, I think the nature of work has fundamentally changed. A lot of banks in Manhattan are trying to get their employees back in 5 days a week. David probably knows more about this than I do. Given they've got so much commercial real estate, it's not a popular measure. I think, probably some kind of hybrid model will be in place for a long time. That's not specific to the US, though.
But is there a problem that they seem to be trying hard to get everything back as it was, rather than thinking, actually the world is different and we ought to listen to what our employers, am I being wrong?
I think different employers are taking different approaches. If you're a big bank and have a lot of commercial real estate that you've got a lease on, you want workers back in the office because otherwise you're just lighting that money on fire effectively. A lot of employers are allowing for hybrid working, and that's what workers want. So if you look at the history of cities in the US, they always come back after major crises. And so, I'm not sure that hybrid working will be a factor forever, but I think it will last for a long time.
I mean, this goes to a sort of another point, which is so much happened during the pandemic, so much in a way that if we really study it, understand it, we can learn from and improve how our economies work in the future. But because so much of what happened was politicized and still is politicized, there's a real risk that we won't learn, I guess. And David, I was wondering what, to the extent that you can see in China, to what extent do you think there will be real learning about the pandemic in the way the Chinese economy is run in the future? I mean, learning in a positive sense rather than kind of knee-jerk reactions. And, the thing that you spoke about earlier in terms of turning in, do you think there could be positive learning in China as well, which or in other emerging economies?
Well, I think, in a way, as I trying to, when I was talking earlier about the convenience, if you like, of keeping the borders closed as a pandemic response, because it kind of fits in with Chinese policymakers' shift towards self-reliance. In a way, I think that the sort of learning in Beijing may be a more negative one, in the sense that it kind of reinforces what was already a pre-existing inclination to emphasize self-reliance. And I think that inclination comes partly from geopolitics, just the sense that, there are a bunch of countries out there that are not supportive of China's rise, of China's ambitions for itself. And also, there is a greater sense that ideology in China is shaping economic policy. I mean, in a way, Megan talked about, the role of the state becoming more evident in Western countries. Well, that's also true in China. Last year, for example, state-owned enterprises accounted for over half of corporate investment for the first time since 2005. There'd been a long period where private sector companies in China were, spending the lion's share of corporate investment spending. That's no longer true. Xi Jinping, since 2017, has been emphasizing the need for bigger, better, stronger SOEs. He's now got that. And I think, private sector is under an additional kind of ideological squeeze because of the emphasis in Beijing on common prosperity, on countering what they describe as the disorderly expansion of capital. And there is, I think, a greater sense of, the state standing up again. And I think that fits in with a more inward-looking policy. And I think that, if anything, the persistence of their zero tolerance approach to COVID reinforces that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, after SARS, in a way, it was slightly different, as I understand it. That there was basically, you're saying it's not going to be the same as after SARS. I mean,
absolutely. I think China's a very different place from the mid-2000s.
Yeah. And how about learning in the US? Are there positive processes where, in a sense, the US society, US economy will learn from this? Or do you think it's not so positive?
Which part of the US, I guess, is the challenge? And then that's my, I'm joking, but it's also an answer, just in that the response has been so decentralized in the US because of how we're set up. It's really state governors who have the power.
Are there any kind of truth commissions, any kind of really serious public inquiries that are going on at the present time, or?
No, not really. To inquire into why certain states
to look
did certain things.
I mean, in the UK, there is intended to be a big public inquiry. I mean, that's something the Prime Minister has promised. And, these can take an awful long time, and, by the time they conclude, maybe it would, but equally, they can also be very informative, especially if they're done well. I just wondered if in the US there's any...
There's no talk of one. No, that doesn't seem to be on the table. I will say, though, that what we saw in the US was that actually it wasn't official measures that made the difference in people's behavior. It was fear in a pandemic. And so, it's frustrating that different states in the US are doing different things. And so it's hard to figure out what the lesson to be learned is. But on the other hand, maybe the lesson is that, individuals were responsible themselves. So, we saw states that opened up early after the first lockdown had the same spending roughly adjusted for population as states that opened up late, which just means if people felt like going to a bar was going to land them up in the hospital, they didn't go. So maybe the answer is more that individuals have a role to play regardless of what official measures are. I do think that at the federal level, though, there were lessons learned in terms of kind of vaccine procurement and deployment that will keep for subsequent rounds of this pandemic or the next one. So there, I think that was a major success that hopefully will carry into the next crisis.
I mean, there was a key sort of public-private element in that.
Yeah.
Do you think that has broader applicability in terms of how governments operate, or do you think it was very unique and specific to the crisis, to the specific skills that pharma companies brought, and to the needs? I mean,
I think it was unique to the crisis. I mean, so much private capital went into finding a vaccine. I think in the absence of another crisis of that magnitude, we probably wouldn't see that kind of cooperation again.
And in China, you mentioned, David, the fact that the Chinese-made vaccines are not proving as effective as Western vaccines, at least up to now. Do you think there will be any, firstly, how do you think this is going to be resolved? Will China come up with its own mRNA vaccine, or do you think there is a broader kind of understanding in China of the role that the private sector needs to play in these kind of critical national objectives?
I think it's very likely that China will come up with its own mRNA vaccines, which are already in sort of a fairly advanced testing stages. Obviously, we don't know to what extent they'll be effective. And China has, bought the Pfizer oral therapy for COVID. So, I can imagine that China will be in a much better state of preparedness for lifting a zero tolerance approach, once the political calendar makes that more convenient. And let's just hope that both the political calendar and the sort of epidemiological preparedness coincide.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we're getting very close to the end, but I have one kind of key question. We've had a series of crises. We had the global financial crisis, the pandemic. Ukraine crisis, I mean, Russian attack on Ukraine, I mean, all of these, you know, off the Richter scale in terms of things we might have expected during the 90s and the noughties.
Yeah.
What do you think the next big global crisis is going to be?
I mean, I think we're already in it, the climate crisis, probably.
And that will kind of shrink into an immediate, I mean, rather than a spread out crisis.
I think it's, well, so I think it has already started to crystallize. Look at the wildfires we've seen in Greece or, you know, in California, floods. There have been a whole bunch of natural disasters that are linked to climate change. We economists forever have said when the climate change crisis comes, I think most of us are coming around to the idea that it's already here.
Yeah. David, what's your next big crisis?
I'm not sure if it's a global shaking crisis, but I do think that low-income developing countries, against a background where US monetary conditions may be tightening very substantially in order to allow the US to deal with its inflation problem, together with the rather negative trends that I was talking about earlier with respect to the future of global trade growth, I do think that low-income developing countries now face some pretty grim times in managing their external debt burdens.
Yeah. And we have seen in the past these kind of debt crises can multiply. I mean, it can be something very big, even if it just starts in, you know, one part of the world. It can be on a global scale.
Yes, I mean that was true. Certainly true in the early 1980s when, you know, default by developing countries, you know, created what was almost an existential threat to the United States banking system. That's not true, fortunately, now.
Okay.
So I don't think even a fairly widespread crisis of unpayable debt among low-income countries creates the same kind of global systemic threat that it did 40 years ago, thank goodness. But it's going to be pretty unpleasant for the countries themselves.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank Megan Greene and David Lubin for some really great insights. I'm sure this is an issue, hopefully, we'll come back to in the future. But for now, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us for this discussion.